Hey everybody, this is Richie Mitchell. I'm here at the Graham Academy School in Kingston, Pennsylvania, and this is where we germinate our seeds and raise our baby plants into nice size seedlings that can be transplanted out into our school garden. This video, however, is to discuss some of the common problems you might have when you're trying to grow your own plants from seeds, and some things you can consider to have a better shot at growing your own plants this year. Now, most people go out and they buy a whole bunch of seed packets. They don't necessarily read the how many days it will take to get those baby seeds into an adult plant. So they plant all of their seeds at the same time. And before you know it, you may have noticed this, you have hundreds and hundreds of plants of all different kinds, all growing at different paces, and you start running out of space. You might not have enough light to keep them healthy. You might not have enough time to water them. Sometimes you water them too much, and a whole bunch of things can happen, but they usually start off looking nice and green and healthy, and you get all excited, and then they start getting too big, and then they start wilting, and they stop growing, and they start dying, and you get frustrated. So, there's basically two main things I want to talk about in this video. Number one is to look at that seed packet and see how many days it takes to reach maturity. So you want to be planting the seeds that take the longest. You want to plant those seeds first. So the plants that grow the slowest and take the longest are the ones that need to get planted first, but they're also the ones that are going to be easier to maintain for a few months indoors. So here I have a whole bunch of different plants. I'm going to give you a couple examples, however, of some plants we planted at the proper time and plants that we planted a little too early. Okay? Now, so the first thing we're talking about is timing. Here are some red gem marigolds. This is an edible marigold. It's one of my favorites. It's pretty easy to grow, but it grows a little slowly at first. So this is a plant, we planted these seeds in January, and that was a great time to plant them. Here are some onions. This is also a slow-growing plant. So certain flowers, certain vegetables, certain herbs grow pretty slowly, and you want to plant them first because they take longer to grow. Now, here is an example of another type of marigold. This is Durango Outback Mix, and it's already starting to get flower buds. So this variety was planted, I would say, a month too early. You can tell it's a much bigger plant, and it's becoming more of a challenge for us to take care of it. Now, keep getting bigger and bigger. This is a giant marigold. Now, we probably planted these 6 weeks too early. Giant marigolds grow very rapidly, and they require much more space for their roots. So that leads us to our next consideration. So consideration number one is planting the proper seeds at the proper timing. The plants you could plant first are slow-growing plants, and also plants that, like these broccoli plants, that like the cold weather, because they can be transferred out into your garden when the weather's still cold. So before they start getting yellow, before they start losing their vigor, they're already going out into the garden. So plants that like the cold can be planted, seeded first. Plants that grow slowly can be seeded also first. And then plants such as tomatoes. Where's my tomato? They grow a little too fast to be planting early. You don't want to plant vigorous growing plants too early in the season, or you're not going to have enough space to take care of them. You're not going to be able to give them enough room and to transplant them enough to keep them healthy. So that leads us into the second most important thing, and that is to be able to plan for transplanting and to transplant enough times to stick with the vigor of that plant. So basically, you have to keep up with the vigor and the growth of the plants that you grow. Growing slower growing plants makes that job a little easier, but nonetheless, you have to transplant many, many times. So I'm going to quickly talk about the strategies we use to grow plants. We start off by planting. I like to have the students plant seeds in a larger container so that they can scatter them out. And instead of planting one seed or two seeds per cell, it's a lot easier just to plant a few dozen, sometimes a few hundred of the same variety. And then you have lots of room to make errors. You can you have enough plants to transplant. If those transplants die, you keep some growing so that you can redo your transplanting and have extra plants. So it's okay to plant lots and lots of extra plants. You always want to have extra plants, but you want to let your seedlings grow together. This is what I do. I allow them to grow closely together to save time, but I only allow them to grow together for a few weeks. Here are some pepper plants. Peppers are another plant that grows slowly. After about 3 to 4 weeks, you want to transplant them into their individual containers. So the first thing we do is we go into these 6 packs that hold 60 plants per growing tray. So here's a typical growing tray. I forget the exact size, but they're pretty standard. So you're planting your seeds, and 3 to 4 weeks later, you're immediately transplanting them. So when the seeds first come up, they have baby leaves. You'll notice they'll start getting their first adult leaves. Let's see, I don't even know if the camera is picking up on that. See that tomato leaf? That's the first adult leaf versus the baby leaves. So 3 weeks after the plants come up, maybe a month, you have to get them transplanted into their first container. Okay? So then once they're transplanted, they're going to start growing nicely. They're going to get vigorous. They're going to grow their adult leaves. Everything's going to be doing great. But then they're going to start to stall out and stop growing, and they're going to become harder to water as they get bigger. So then another 3 to 4 weeks after that, you're going to want to go into an even bigger container. So if you're transplanting within 3 weeks, you can go into something like this, which is 48 plants per planting tray. So you can go from 60 to 48 if you want. And then another 3 weeks later, you can go into something like this, which is 32 plants per planting tray. Now, if you notice, it seems like we're transplanting a lot, and we are. We're going from one to the next to the next, and we're doing that every 3 weeks or so. And the key thing to remember is it is extremely good for the plants to constantly be transplanting them. And the reason, the reason that is because the plants will become root bound. Because we're planting into plastic containers, the plant's roots automatically grow to the edges and then grow straight down and then start circling around and around and around and become root bound. And here's a good example. Here's a sunflower plant. Becoming root bound, the roots are actually starting to yellow a little bit. The plant is losing its vigor, its leaves are browning. It's not really growing as healthy as we want it to be growing. So going back to point number 1, know how fast your seeds are going to grow and how long they're going to take to reach adulthood. Something like a sunflower plant or a tomato plant is going to need to be transplanted into bigger and bigger containers, and you're going to quickly run out of space and not have enough manpower to keep them healthy. Something like a flower or an herb or an onion is going to be much more easy to manage. When you're transplanting, a lot of people just want to go straight into the biggest possible container. That is not going to be great because the seeds, the plant's roots, are going to grow to the bottom of that container and start circling around and around no matter what size of container you use. Eventually, those roots are going to hit the bottom and start circling. Okay, so it's, instead of going from a small container into a huge container, it's much better to do many, many transplants every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks. And the way you can get away with doing that, let me pop a plant out of a container here. You take your plant. Now this one actually doesn't really need to be transplanted. The roots aren't really circling. So let's get a better example here. There, you take a plant where the roots are growing out of control, and see, this is actually in a 32 plant per tray container already. So it's going to be hard to find a container big enough for this to be transplanted into. Wrong. What you do is you actually trim off some of these roots. You can take your hand and you can just break them off. You could take scissors, you could be a little more clean about it. But all of those roots that are circling and getting tangled together, you literally root prune and cut them off. And then I also shake off some of the soil. So then I'm left with a much smaller root ball, and now this plant can more easily be transplanted into a bigger container, but I don't need a huge container. So that's how I'm able to go from a little container to a slightly bigger container is because every time we transplant, we're ripping off some of the roots, knocking off some of the soil. We're still keeping a root ball, but every time you rip off some of those roots, you now allow that plant to branch out. And every time you give it a little more soil in a slightly bigger container, those roots could now reach out and grow within that new soil and have access to all of that new nutrients and that new environment. If you take a plant with the roots going around in circles and you just plop that into a bigger container, you're not fixing the problem. The plant still has tons of roots that are all tangled together. Instead, we're pruning those roots, getting the plant, getting those roots to be branching out in all different directions, and that way when we transplant it, we're giving it fresh soil for those roots to explore. And then as those roots grow into the new soil, that also stimulates the plant and keeps the plant healthy. If you're not breaking up those root balls, the plant is suffering and is under stress and starts to become yellow and have other types of problems. Now, one thing to consider is if you don't keep your plants vigorous, they're going to have pest and disease problems. They're going to be stunted. They're going to be more susceptible to fungus problems. So if you're not keeping your plants vigorous and healthy, when they go out into the garden, they're going to have disease problems and other issues throughout the growing season. So it's really important to make sure your plants stay nice and green and healthy. And the one way we do that is by making sure that they have enough space through multiple transplants, giving them enough room of soil for their roots to explore. Now, another thing to consider is watering and fertilizing, and that's a topic that we're going to talk about in another video. However, one thing to know is if you're constantly transplanting your plants constantly have access to more fresh soil, and the roots are not getting tied in knots. That actually helps you better deal with soil moisture and soil fertility. But we'll talk about that more in another video. I hope you like this. I hope it wasn't too long. If you like it, please click the like button. And if you would like me to make shorter videos or different styles of videos, please leave a comment. It has a lot of value to me. Again, here we are at the Graham Academy, growing lots of different flowers, lots of different vegetables. We're paying attention to the instructions on the seed packet. We're planting the seeds, the plants that grow the slowest. We're planting them first. We're planting seeds or plants that can tolerate cold weather first, because they're going to be able to go outside the earliest. And our plants such as tomatoes and sunflowers and other plants that grow very vigorously, we're trying not to plant them too early. We're trying to wait 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, so that we don't have to take up all of our space. So you're going to have to manage the space that you have and the resources and the time that you have, because it's much better to have healthy plants and less of them than to have thousands of stunted plants.